Formula One has been around since 1950 and the concept of motor racing even before that. F1 has changed a lot and is very different in 2018 than it was in the 1950s. In this video, I will talk about some of the main things that have changed over the years. But before we get into that, please like and subscribe if you like some of the videos I make. Let's get started. The biggest difference were the cars. Surprisingly, the F1 cars of today and the ones of the 1950s weighed about the same, around 700 kilograms. Although these days, the cars produce about twice the power. These days, F1 cars have very powerful brakes, but in the 1950s, the cars had drum brakes. You might notice that the tires were also a lot thinner back then. Not only that, but they were also treaded. Slick tires were not introduced in F1 until 1971. Back then, reducing drag and straight line speed was a big priority, so there were no front or rear wings, allowing the cars to cut through the air like a knife through butter. This made them fast on the straights, but very slow and unstable in the corners. These days, aerodynamics and producing downforce for cornering speed is much more focused on, instead of reducing drag to be fast on the straights. Safety was also much less of a priority than it was today. There was no halo, no seatbelts, the helmets were almost useless, and the way the fuel was carried meant that it was very easy for the cars to catch fire in the event of an accident. Those cars were basically 300-kilometer-an-hour coffins. The drivers were also very different back then. Most were usually older than 40, some in their mid-50s. Juan Manuel Fangio, a 5-time world champion, took his first ever win at the age of 39. The oldest driver to start a race was 55-year-old Luigi Fagioli at the 1955 Monaco Grand Prix, finishing in 6th place. Luigi Fagioli holds the record for being the oldest race winner, taking victory at the 1951 French Grand Prix at the age of 53. This is older than most of the fathers of today's drivers, with the likes of Max Verstappen getting into Formula One before they even get their road driver's licenses. It's fascinating to see how much older the drivers were back then. The age of all the drivers in the upcoming 2019 Australian Grand Prix will be 27 years old. The oldest ever average driver age was 42 years in the 1951 French Grand Prix. The inaugural F1 season in 1950 only had 6 races. All were in Europe. This is unless you include the Indianapolis 500, which is actually part of the F1 calendar back then. The 2018 F1 calendar had 3 times as many races on 5 different continents. Only Africa and, well, here don't have a race, although there was previously a South African Grand Prix. With Liberty Media now in charge, the number of races will potentially increase to 25 per season. Come on, Liberty, let's have an Antarctic Grand Prix. Although some tracks from the 1950s are on the F1 calendar in 2018, the circuits have changed a lot too. The only track that has stayed relatively the same over the years is Monaco. Back then, the circuits were long, bumpy, and had inadequate marshals and crash barriers. There were no purpose-built tracks like Abu Dhabi or Shanghai. The cars were one thing, but the circuits were way more dangerous. One of the most famous of these tracks was the old Nürburgring, Nordschleife, nicknamed the Green Hell. This 73-corner, 20-kilometer-long track is almost 3 times longer than the longest circuit on the 2018 calendar. There were also many other bizarre tracks, like the Avis circuit in Berlin. This is actually the full name, but I don't want to even attempt to pronounce that. Avis was basically 2 long straights connected by dangerous hairpins. Imagine if this circuit was used in 2018. The point scoring system was very different also. From 1950 to 1953, only the top 5 drivers scored points, with 8 going to the winning driver, 6 for 2nd place, 4 for 3rd place, 3 for 4th, and 2 for 5th. Nowadays, the top 10 drivers score points, with 25 for the 1st place. Imagine if only the top 5 scored points in today's Formula One. Midfield teams would have no hope of ever scoring points, and even some of the front-running cars would not even score. 2018 world champion Lewis Hamilton scored 408 points. That is more than all the points scored in the 1950 and 1951 seasons combined. Obviously, there were much less races and less points were awarded, but you get the idea. It was much harder to score points and less points were rewarded back in the 1950s. Back then, the races were longer, bumpier, and more dangerous. The drivers were also less physically fit than the drivers of today. Many drivers shared a car during a race, similar to what they do in endurance racing. The points they scored was equally distributed amongst the two drivers. If the shared car finished in 5th place and scored 2 points, each driver would be rewarded with 1 point. The last and most famous example of this was the 1957 British Grand Prix, when the shared car of Stirling, Moss, and Tony Brooks took victory, but 2nd place Luigi Musso scored more points. There were also points for fastest lap back then, but that would be silly in today's F1 because backmarker teams could just put on a fresh set of tires at the end of the race and just go for fastest lap. Back then, the timing was not very accurate. It was usually someone with a stopwatch, and the times were only calculated to the second. There was no accurate thousandth of a second timing system in the 1950s. This meant the point for the fastest lap was often shared between drivers. In the 1954 British Grand Prix, a whopping 7 drivers set a lap time of 1 minute and 50 seconds, which meant each of them were rewarded with an extra 1/7 or 0.143 of a point. As you can see, the point system was very complicated and produced many weird results in the 1950s. Pit stops in F1 have evolved and changed drastically over the years. Many things are different. These days, up to 20 people can be working on a car during a pit stop, with each of them having their own job. In the 1950s, only 4 mechanics were allowed to work on the car. Refueling was also allowed back then, adding even more time to the pit stop. The wheel guns these days can produce mind-blowing amounts of torque, allowing wheel nuts to be screwed on and off in a matter of seconds. The combination of advanced technology and more mechanics means that the pit stops in today's F1 take only 2 seconds. In the 1950s, pit stops could take up to a minute. F1 has changed a lot in its 68-year history. Some changes were for the good, some were for the bad. But the DNA of Formula 1 remains the same. Cars going flat out, drivers risking their lives and racing on the limit, mechanics and engineers pushing the boundaries of what is technologically possible. Those parts of Formula 1 has never changed and hopefully never will. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. Hopefully you found it interesting. Obviously, I didn't list all the ways these two eras of F1 are different, only the main differences. If you liked this video or another video I made, please subscribe to my channel, Kids Love F1. I'm still on the road to 100 subscribers, and I would like to achieve that very soon. Please feel free to request a video in the comments section below. I will try my best to listen to some of your requests. As always, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Bye.